Greetings, sisters and brothers. Welcome to African History Club, episode number 38. I'm your host, Milton Alimadi. I welcome all of you. And as always, I want to thank all of you for the support you have extended all these many months to African History Club. So today, I would like to focus on South Africa. As I indicated in the last podcast, whenever there's a topical issue that I feel it's worth commenting on, I will interrupt and address that issue. And then I'll go back to discussing my book, Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media. South Africa has been in a measure of significant turmoil since July the 7th. That's when former President Jacob Zuma was arrested after he had defied the courts and refused to appear to testify in an ongoing case in which he is involved, where he is charged with corruption when he was president of South Africa. And in terms of Zuma's corruption, that's extensively been covered, so it's not worth spending much time addressing that in this podcast. So the big issue was the court sentenced Zuma to 15 months imprisonment after he defied the courts, and he was held in contempt of court, and that is why he was subsequently arrested. And then the upheaval started, the violent protest, and the targeting, the looting of shopping malls and businesses in the wealthy parts of South Africa. Obviously, that's not an issue that is analyzed or discussed when you see the coverage in media outlets such as CNN. But that is why we have a podcast like this, because then we can get to address those kind of issues. And it's ironic that the South African upheaval started on July the 7th, because that is also when the president of Haiti, Jovenel Moise, was assassinated. And of course, Haiti had already been experiencing significant upheaval as the elite in Haiti struggled for power. But we'll get back to Haiti in another podcast, in another episode. Today, let's focus on South Africa. So Zuma's supporters have defended him using a number of issues. So, for example, many of his supporters say, how dare the state arrest former President Jacob Zuma, considering the significant role he played in fighting against the apartheid regime, devoted much of his life, really, in the struggle, including the armed resistance, to liberate South Africa from the odious racist apartheid system, which ultimately collapsed in 1994 with the election of Nelson Mandela as the first African president of South Africa. And of course, whenever I talk about the liberation of South Africa, I always mention Cuba. We must never, ever forget the Battle of Puerto Cuanaval in Angola, when Cuban forces fighting alongside Angolans and ANC and SWAPO, which was the Liberation Army of Namibia, dealt the until then seemingly invincible South African military machine a decisive defeat. And they fled with their tail between their legs, quickly went on to grant the independence of Namibia, quickly went on to release Nelson Mandela in 1990, paving the way for the elections of 1994. So Zuma supporters say, how can Zuma be arrested considering not only his contribution to the struggle to liberate South Africa, but also the fact that the engineers, the architects, the perpetrators of the apartheid regime, the European South African criminals who oppressed, exploited Africans for centuries. Yes, it's for centuries, even though the apartheid regime formally existed from 1948 to 1994. For centuries, a white colonial imperialism had exploited Africans in South Africa all those centuries. And at the end of formal apartheid, these criminals who tormented Nelson Mandela, Winnie Mandela, and killed countless South Africans in many massacres, including the Sharpeville massacre, the Soweto massacre, killed many of their leaders. Steve Biko, murdered in 1977, only age 30, destroyed Robert Sebukwe, leading ultimately to his death as well, and many, many other young African leaders of the resistance against apartheid, killed by European South Africans who never paid the price. Why? Because South Africa had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where people, basically, these criminals just came and testified, acknowledged their roles, apologized, and they were granted immunity and amnesty. So Zuma's supporters say, how dare the state put Zuma behind bars when these European South Africans with blood dripping on their hands were never punished for their crimes. Well, here is how I address that issue. Many of us were not fully supportive of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We realized how important it was and the need for it. But personally, I don't think it should have been a blanket approach. I think certain criminals, most certainly those responsible for killing Steve Biko and others, should never have been eligible to appear before that commission, and they should have been fully prosecuted for those cowardly murders of young South Africans at the prime of their life, people who could have contributed significantly to the post-apartheid regime. Steve Biko certainly eventually would have been a leader, most definitely a president of a liberated South Africa as well. That's number one. And then number two, which is actually critical, the African National Congress, the party of Jacob Zuma, the party of Nelson Mandela, the party of the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, they negotiated the dissolution, at least formal dissolution, of the apartheid regime. So that is a bed that they helped to prepare. So you can't then after the fact say that because those criminals were not prosecuted, that Zuma therefore should also not be prosecuted for the crimes that he seems to have been carrying out during the time he was president of South Africa. Or at least the trial should go through, and he should appear before the courts and let a decision ultimately be rendered. And here's the danger of not prosecuting former President Zuma. Nelson Mandela, when he was alive, knew that Zuma, while a tremendous asset in the liberation struggle, was also potential great liability. And I understand he had actually given instructions that Zuma should be given, I believe the figure was more than $1 million, to be made available to Zuma. And why was that? That supposedly would have diminished his proclivity of acquiring illegal proceeds. In other words, he would not have been susceptible to corruption now that you have $1 million at your disposal. Now, whether that sum was made available or not, obviously $1 million is not a huge amount of money to Zuma, who is accused of having spent several millions of dollars just to renovate his private home alone using state funds. And here's the danger of not really prosecuting Zuma. If he is seen as above the law, above the legal system, above the constitution in South Africa, then why stop at Jacob Zuma? What about if there is a case involving another senior ANC official and an official of any other party in South Africa, or any organization in South Africa, or any prominent person in South Africa? If Zuma is above the law, why should not any other significant official, or any regular citizen for that matter, be above the law in South Africa? And I don't say this lightly. I say this because if we look at the history of most African countries, most of them had constitutions at the time they won formal independence. I mean, I call it paper independence because the so-called independence did not address really issues of economic independence, the power relations between these periphery countries and the center. And that is the issue today, even when we are discussing South Africa. Power still resides in the industrialized countries, the former colonial powers that ruled formerly in Africa, and today rule by using their financial might to continue really a neo-colonial relationship with South Africa. So that was never addressed at the independence, and we can understand why. Because when you negotiate independence, when you negotiate how to sever relations with your former exploitator, then obviously the terms are going to be favorable to the side which is more powerful. I have never seen, or I'm not aware in history, where the one side that exploits negotiates the end of that relationship, and that the formerly exploited then becomes powerful, controlling its sovereignty, its destiny, its economics, and succeeds, become an independent economic power. It certainly has not happened for a single one of the African countries. And I like using the example of China, and I've used it before in a past podcast. China is China today because China ruptured its relations with the West that used to exploit China through the Chinese Revolution, and they set up an agenda that would address all of the issues in China on China's own terms. That is not the situation in African countries. But nevertheless, most of these countries had constitutions which, for example, limited the number of terms that a president or prime minister could be in office. And invariably, in many of these countries, that constitution was eviscerated, term limits removed, and we ended up having life presidents in Africa. And as the politicians showed their contempt for the Constitution and for the country, then of course the generals also had no incentive to think those constitutions were anything except pieces of paper. And then we had the proliferation of military coups d'etat in African countries. And of course, many of them backed and instigated by the former colonial rulers, who obviously have always favored and preferred to deal with ruthless dictators who are not beholden to niceties such as parliamentary systems in African countries. So that is the other part of the story. And I say all this to suggest that it would be dangerous for South Africa to risk pursuing that same path that has led to much of the misery and destruction in many African countries. You don't want to have this kind of domestic rupture while at the same time you're still trying to fight the beast, the center, the former colonial powers who are today's the controllers by maintaining these new colonial relationships. So you don't want that double dilemma. And that is why it's very dangerous when supporters of Jacob Zuma suggest that he should be given an exception. All right, so now let's address the issue of the uprisings. President Cyril Ramaphosa, who is also the leader of the ANC, the ruling party, has characterized these individuals as quote unquote opportunist and criminal elements. It is so ironic because this is precisely what the European South Africans during the apartheid era used to say when South African youth also were protesting or demonstrating. And when there were uprisings, violent uprisings as well, against the system. So it's ironic that somebody who fought against apartheid should say something like that. The uprisings obviously go beyond the mere arrest of Zuma. While Zuma has significant support in the ANC, the targeted institutions, establishments, the stores, the businesses, suggest that there's a lot more going on in South Africa, which is the bubbling of the discontent which exists in South Africa today. And let's look at some of the statistics alone. And these are official stats, which always underestimate the severe nature of the situation on the ground. So in South Africa, officially unemployment is at 37%. That's for Black unemployment. Overall unemployment is 33%. White unemployment is under 9%. It's less than 9%. And European South Africans also make up less than 9% of the population. And Africans, of course, make up almost 90% of the population is Black. Now let's look at the youth unemployment, for example. From the age ranges 15 to 24, 63%. This is unconscionable. Ages 25 to 34, 41%. Black women unemployment, 39%, almost 40%. And the World Bank says South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, although it's hard to imagine that any country can be more unequal than the United States, with all the Jeff Bezos of the United States. When you have homelessness at record highs and people suffering from hunger as well in the United States. But these are some of the stats in South Africa. 20% of households control more than 70% of the income. And then here is really what I would call the third rail, which I think eventually will be resolved somehow or the other: the ownership of land. So while European South Africans make up less than 9% of the population, they still control more than 70% of the prime agricultural land. And we're talking 27 years after the end of apartheid, with the election of Mandela in 1994. In fact, if you look at it carefully, the West still has sanctions against Zimbabwe. I maintain that those sanctions are not really against Zimbabwe per se. Yes, of course, it is against Zimbabwe. It's debilitated the economy, and the sanctions were imposed when the late Robert Mugabe carried out the land redistribution, and seized the land that was controlled by European Zimbabweans whose ancestors had stolen it from Africans, and he returned them to Africans. And part of the story that is not widely discussed was that at the time Zimbabwe got independence in 1980, at the Lancaster conferences, the United States and Britain had committed to provide funds to make it available for the Zimbabwe government to pay European Zimbabweans for the land. And those funds never came because the British government ultimately reneged on that agreement, and then the U.S. obviously saw no reason to carry through if the British were backing off. So those sanctions are still maintained. Why? Even after the death of Mugabe, and even after the Zimbabwe government has now made some reconciliatory efforts and invited some of these Europeans to come back. Why? It is because it is meant as a signal to South Africa, to South African government, and to the government in Namibia as well. Don't you dare attempt a Zimbabwe approach to the land issue in South Africa or in Namibia. That is why in both these countries, formerly administered by Europeans, the land is still controlled by Europeans. This is so explosive that nobody should be shocked if we really see significant upheaval in South Africa over the land issue, because when you combine it with this level of unemployment, disillusionment that I just discussed, and now when we see the kind of, I call this like a flash moment, the violent protests that we're seeing now. It's a flash moment of what could still come if the underlying causes are not addressed in South Africa. And to be frank with you, these issues probably will not be addressed by an ANC government, which is now, in fact, one of the biggest defenders of capital. So the ANC actually is in alliance with European capital to maintain the status quo in South Africa. And obviously, South Africa is a very young country, just like much of Africa, country of the youth. And the more they are marginalized, and the more they see that the government is not delivering on the post-apartheid era of radically transforming the economy to benefit the masses, I see this really heightening the level of radicalism. And it's not by accident, by the way, that increasingly the party of Julius Malema, the economic freedom fighters, in successive years continue to grow stronger. They are the ones who are at the forefront of addressing the land issue, and even suggested that there should be a Zimbabwe-style approach in South Africa. And it was only then that the ANC started talking seriously about the need to address the land issue. So that is where really things stand. You won't get this type of interpretation of what is going on in South Africa if you only rely on watching CNN or the BBC or other corporate media outlets. What we have in South Africa is a failure of the system to transform, to address the needs of the marginalized, the dispossessed, the low income South Africans. And by the way, let me also address one other point. You only see the images of black people in the looting. But in fact, poor white people have also been involved in looting in South Africa. There's also that underclass, the class issue, class segmentation in South Africa is also the other aspect that is not addressed in any of these corporate media approaches. That in fact, European South Africans, Indians, and so-called coloreds, who are people of mixed race, parentage, that's what they refer to as coloreds in South Africa, have also all been involved in the looting. Obviously, you'll see more images of Africans because they make up the vast majority of the population. But by not showing that non-Africans are also involved, it gives the suggestion that this is just, it goes back to lending credibility to the nonsense when President Ramaphosa says, oh, these are only criminal elements. Hardly. After all, you also used to be referred to as a criminal element by the apartheid state. And also, there's another troubling sign that has not been covered by corporate media. You understand that more than 200 people have been killed. Well, a lot of the killings have also been carried out by white vigilante groups who are heavily armed in South Africa. And we saw them pop out when the apartheid regime was collapsing in the 1990s. Many of them were randomly targeting black people for killings and assassinations. And now, obviously, their weapons never went away and they never went away. So some of them have also been involved in these killings. So South Africa has a potentially explosive situation because the issues of creating the new South Africa, new dispensation, never really has been addressed. The ANC simply did what Steve Biko warned against. I want to now end by, I want to close out by reading a quote from Steve Biko, who was murdered in 1977, which means this statement that he made, it was made at least 44 years ago. And if you want to see it, I've referred to it in the past. If you go to YouTube and you search under Biko Speaks on the Black Consciousness Movement, you'll see it's about a 24-minute video. Many of you have seen it. So let me read quickly and then I close out. Quote, this is from Biko. There's no running away from the fact now that in South Africa, there's such an uneven distribution of wealth that any form of political freedom which does not touch on the proper distribution of wealth will be meaningless. The whites have locked up within a small minority of themselves the greater proportion of the country's wealth. And if we have a mere change of face, meaning if we replace European South Africans with black people and that's it, let me continue now. Of those in government position, what is likely to happen is that black people will continue to be poor and we will get a few blacks filtering through into the so-called bourgeoisie. And one of those is the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, and the former president, Jacob Zuma. So we now see another struggle between the elite in South Africa, and the issues of the masses are yet to be addressed. So thank you, sisters and brothers, friends. I now close this episode number 38. See you next time.